Most viewers know the federal government is debating how to slow down spending increases and to at least curb the growth in the federal deficit, but state governments have less of an option. And in Massachusetts, there's a gap of almost $2 billion that has to be closed by higher taxes, lower spending, or both. But the policy group United for a Fair Economy has made the case for a different solution, not just the amount of taxation, but how the burden is shared. And to tell us about the report that was issued today is our guest from UFE, the director of the Tax Fairness Organizing Collaborative, Kraut. Thank you very much for being with us, Karen.
Thanks for having me today, Chris.
I know in Massachusetts we're probably not in the worst situation in this country, but in general, if you let things go the way they're headed with cuts in the budget to close the budget gaps, what's the downside of that?
Well, Chris, the biggest problem with a budget cut approach, well, there are many problems, but one is that it's completely counterproductive when the economy is fragile. When you're cutting budgets, you're eliminating jobs, you're adding to unemployment, you're disinvesting in the very structures, the public structures that make our nation strong and that contribute to a strong workforce. So there are a lot of short-term pain for families as well as really long-term consequences in budget cuts. But the other thing is that it just doesn't have to be this way. I think there's a real misunderstanding about the underlying root of our budget deficits, which is it's a revenue problem. We have a poorly designed tax structure in every state in the country. And if you have a poorly designed tax structure, you are not generating the kind of revenue that you should be generating. So our report addresses directly the revenue problem that's at the root cause of these budget deficits.
Because there's also a perception problem too, because you want to make taxes more progressive, that is, they fall more heavily on people who have more money. Now, some of our viewers might be saying, well, if you make more money, you pay a higher state income tax, you probably own a house that's more expensive, so you pay a higher property tax. Isn't that progressive?
Well, when you look at taxes on individually, you can see how they fall differently, but what we're talking about is looking at the major state and local taxes collectively and how they fall on families across the income spectrum in every state. And what you find is that every single state has a regressive structure when you look at all the major tax vehicles at the state and local level combined. Some are slightly less regressive than others, but every state has a regressive tax structure.
Chris, another way that I'm sure you're looking at very carefully here is the tax burden as a percentage of household income. And I guess if you look at that, you see a difference, right?
Yes, I mean that's what we're talking about is when you add up all the state and local taxes that you pay and you divide it by your income, that's your share of your income that you pay in state and local taxes. And that's what we're talking about is unfair. And not only is it inequitable, but a lot of people misunderstand that equity really goes hand in hand with economic growth. The more equitable and progressive your tax system, the more you're taxing the right spending and not the wrong spending. So a regressive system taxes low and middle income folks when they spend all their money in the economy. That's exactly where you want money to be, is in the economy being spent. A progressive system gradually taxes the more higher end idle income that is not necessarily spent in the economy. And it takes that income and it puts it to better use from an economic perspective by investing in teachers and jobs and infrastructure and construction and things that really contribute to economic activity. So the interesting thing about the concept of equity is it's really a win-win for everybody. The more equitable your tax structure, the more progressive it is, the more it generates general prosperity and economic activity, which benefits everyone along the income spectrum. So in the narrow perspective, the wealthy folks would have a tax increase in a progressive tax system, but in the broader perspective, in terms of their growing prosperity, they would actually be better off.
Now, of course, we keep hearing about businesses that move to other states because, well, taxes are lower, or maybe they're getting a tax break.
Right.
So, I mean, doesn't that figure into the equation at all?
Sure. I mean, I think that that's used as a scare tactic to keep taxes low on businesses. But the reality is that these kind of tax breaks that are thrown at businesses to attract them really are, first of all, they're unnecessary because corporations make decisions for where they're locating based on a whole host of reasons, and taxes are way down at the very bottom. They want a quality place to live for their employees. They want a good, highly educated workforce. They want transportation systems and ports that are functioning, that allow them to distribute their goods and bring in their supplies. So businesses, like regular people, rely on the very public structures that the government provides and that we pay for collectively as individuals here. And the whole idea that they're going to leave just because of a tax rate is overwhelmingly false. However, of course, a corporation is not going to give back an opportunity to have a tax break if you're going to offer them. But the thing that's sad about giving corporations tax breaks, it's really the mom and pop family businesses that don't get any breaks, that have to compete with these highly profitable multi-state corporations that are getting their tax breaks reduced at the expense of mom and pop businesses throughout the state. And that's where the real job creation happens, is with the small and middle-sized companies, not the big ones.
Talk about Massachusetts, because we have had some state tax increases in recent years after some state tax cuts.
Right.
And people here in most communities, I think, have seen an increase in their property taxes as well. So what should be changed here?
So the big sad thing about the property tax increases is that it's all happening as a result of the state not taking responsibility for generating sufficient revenue. The state needs to have an adequate tax system through the income tax, and right now we have a sales tax, that brings in enough revenue that they can provide local aid so that the municipal governments can keep their property taxes at reasonable levels. As soon as the state cuts taxes at the state level, with the income tax cut from 2000 and other tax cuts, all it does is shift the tax burden to the local level. It doesn't suddenly mean that localities aren't going to plow their roads or provide for their schools. It just means that revenue has to be found elsewhere, and the only option localities have is the property tax. So if the state were to do a better job raising the right amount of revenue through a progressive tax system, then the localities would see that the property taxes would be able to be reduced.
Now, you have to go from policy to politics at some point, and going back in the history of this state, people voted against a graduated income tax in, I think, at least the late 1970s. A lot of inflation in those days, and they voted for Prop 2.5. So I think that scared people away from this idea. Can this be a sell?
Well, in Massachusetts, we have a higher hurdle to achieve, which is a constitutional barrier against a graduated income tax. I know there are some efforts right now to increase the income tax and also increase the personal exemption so that the income tax only falls on the upper middle, the upper income and very wealthy folks in the state. That's one way that they're trying to create a more progressive tax system under the restrictions that we have with our Constitution. But I think that voters, the more they really understand how regressive our tax system is, and that the majority of people are paying a higher percentage of their income in taxes than the very wealthy in our state, I think they'll think differently about this, and they'll want to see more equity. And if they really understand the economic arguments for having a progressive tax system, I think they'll support it.
All right, thank you very much for being with us. Kraut from United for a Fair Economy.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have more news after this message.